Lisa said, I'm Garland Bills and Neddy Vigil, and this is our book that was just published by UNM Press in December, so it's still fresh and still lots of copies. It's a library book, and at $80, it's kind of hard for individuals to cough up that much money. But I'm glad to see a nice crowd here today on a Friday afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. One of the first things that I would like to ask, if there are any of the people here happen to be people who were interviewed for this project. Is anybody, a family, or anybody who was interviewed? Okay, just wanted to recognize those people in case they showed up. To give you a brief overview of this 30-minute or so, probably, presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from the text. Then Neddy is going to show a couple of maps on here. Patricia, how are you? And then I'll read a little bit more, and then some more maps, and then a final reading. And after the reading, we are going to have show this old video called Mapa del Corazón, while if anybody buys a book, we'll sign books up here while this video is showing. It's really a nice video that was produced by KNME back in 1995 when we both looked a lot younger. And did I forget to mention anything that?
The video is on the survey that we conducted, and it goes through various dialect zones. And you can actually hear the speakers from those areas, and it gives sort of the background.
Okay, let me start off with reading a couple of paragraphs. El Español de Nuevo Mexico, New Mexican Spanish. For lovers of language, lovers of the Spanish language in particular, the name evokes emotions of intrigue, mystery, and romance. Made widely known from the beginning of the 20th century by the linguistic and folklore studies of native son Aurelio Macedonio Espinosa, this variety of Spanish has become famous for its distinctiveness, for having survived so well on a remote fringe of the Spanish-speaking world. This book is designed for lovers of language contact and language change, for lovers of the Spanish language in particular, and most especially for lovers of New Mexican Spanish. It is a linguistic exploration delving broadly and deeply into the Spanish language as spoken today by the Hispanic population of New Mexico and southern Colorado. For the authors, it is a linguistic love affair. This book is a study of variation in language. Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, and partially as a consequence of that distribution, it varies considerably from place to place. Beans are called frijoles in Mexico, but judías in Spain, and porotos in Peru. This book is a linguistic atlas. It explores the geography of language variation. It presents language facts on maps, but it is not the typical traditional linguistic atlas that presents material accessible only to the specialists. We provide a lot of technical information, but our overriding intent has been to make this information available to any interested person. Our desire has been to share with all kinds of readers a multitude of facts about New Mexican Spanish, its beauty, its diversity, its history, its present state, its societal conflicts, its prospects for the future.
This is a sample distribution of our consultants. We say consultants instead of interviewees because they really were the experts. And we just recorded what the experts said. We interviewed 357 people, and this is the distribution of that sample. So it was all of New Mexico and 16 counties of southern Colorado. Why southern Colorado? The people from the Tierra Maria area immigrated in 1851 up into that area. So they're an extension of New Mexican Spanish. And if the gold rush hadn't come along, maybe it would have been New Mexico. So that shows the distribution, of course, and of course that distribution follows the waterways, doesn't it? Now, let me show this, a recent Mexicanism. You can see the round circles to the north, and in the lower part, in the south, you see the red squares. That shows the major distribution of the dialects in New Mexico. So you have a north-south characteristic. And this happens to be a recent Mexicanism. It's, the reason for it is Col, which is in the north, is also the standard Spanish. And that's the Spanish that you would find in most of Spain. It by its distribution, which is almost the entire state, it shows that that is the most common word used for a long period of time. The repollo, which is in the very south, you find where in Mexico? You find it in the north, in a reduced area. Or not a reduced area, but most of Mexico actually uses repollo. I have to throw a little statement out that in Mexico City we've heard that col is probably more common. But it shows that the repollo is the form that is now coming into New Mexico. And how is the distribution? The distribution is in the south. We call that border Spanish. We call the north traditional Spanish, and that was a label coined by Lope Blanche, from the linguist from Mexico, and we thought it was a good term to use. The distribution shows that the repollo speakers in the border area, or that border variant, is along the border, which you would expect, but also in that southeast quadrant up in Colorado. Why? Well, immigration into agricultural areas, beet production, that kind of thing, the dry farming area. So you had immigration, Mexican immigration into there, and into the mining areas up around Gallup. And that shows you, that's the border variant. Okay?
Okay, my turn.
I'll let you.
This is from chapter 2, which is New Mexican Spanish Myths and Realities. I'm just going to try to keep it very brief reading to give you an idea of the myths that we treat in here. The first paragraph. Few people have a sophisticated understanding of the nature of human language. Most people are quite unaware of how their own language works. As in other areas where the systematicity lies beyond the limits of our understanding, myths and legends come to the rescue. They make the unknown less ominous. Myths are valuable cultural resources because, above all else, their purpose is to provide reassurance to the community. Consequently, every culture seems to hold dearly to beliefs that have little basis in reality. And on the basis of those beliefs, communities make judgments about the quality of all sorts of behavior, including language behavior. Societies can be quite cruel, rigidly imposing their norms of acceptable behavior. But paradoxically, having that guide to behavior, however devoid of a basis in reality, can be comforting. Myths about language are the police that try to keep the citizenry adhering to the accepted norms of linguistic behavior. Skipping a little bit, in short, beliefs about language reflect the usual societal inequalities. Inequalities captured in seemingly universal fashion in the observation of a well-experienced 86-year-old woman from Trinidad, Colorado, who says, "Bien dicen que la gallina de arriba caga la de abajo." If you don't understand Spanish, for good reason, they say that the chicken on the upper perch shits on the one below. Okay, so just very quickly the myths that we deal with, and I don't have time to justify why we say they're myths. Myth 1, standard Spanish is good, non-standard Spanish is bad. Speakers of New Mexican Spanish are often told that their Spanish is deficient. Thus, for example, an 81-year-old woman from Hobbs, New Mexico, reports on the effect of the attitudes of her Mexican-born husband. She says, hasta me da a mí pena hablar mi español que hablo, porque sometimes él me dice que si hablo chino o japonés. It even makes me sad to speak the Spanish I speak, because sometimes he asks me if I'm speaking Chinese or Japanese. And so that myth about standard Spanish being good and local Spanish being bad is rampant. Myth 2, New Mexican Spanish is the Spanish of 16th century Spain. This myth is rampant. It is reflected in such popular literature as John Nichols' novel, The Milagro Beanfield War. Let me just quote from that great novel. Pacheco could not stand the way Onofre, reading aloud in Spanish, pronounced his C's and Z's. He pronounced them with the Castilian th or th sound. That is, with a lisp, an affectation peculiar to many of the Miracle Valley's old-timers, whereas it could not be found farther south in Mexico. The reason for this being that Onofre's and Seferinos Pacheco's ancestors had come from Spain 4 centuries before, traveled to this godforsaken place in the high Rockies, and then been cut off from civilization for 300 years, thus maintaining many of the purities in their Spanish language and their Spanish customs. Such romantic ideas about the Castilian purity of these people and their language are heard daily in New Mexico. These ideas are sadly in error. No native New Mexican who, unless they've been exposed to peninsular Spanish, says zapato and cielo or something like that. No, it doesn't occur.
In fact, that when I was a kid in Los Alamos, when kids from the valley would speak Spanish, or take Spanish in high school, they were put down because they did not.
Yes.
Myth 3. It is widely assumed that in recognition of this distinctive heritage, Spanish is an official language of New Mexico. Many people, both Hispanics and Anglos, believe that the state constitution gives Spanish special legal status in perpetuity. This belief is a myth. If you have trouble accepting that it is a myth, read the book. If you can't afford the $80 for it, I hope it's in all the libraries. So get your library to order it. Myth 4, and this is a pernicious one. English is good, Spanish is not good. Now, none of you here are going to accept that. But regardless of the stature of Spanish as one of the world's major languages with respect to number of speakers and documented history in the New Mexico, Colorado Spanish Survey area, and in the United States more generally, some people proclaim, and many others harbored the sneaky suspicion that the Spanish language is decidedly inferior to English. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but that has a tremendous effect on the Spanish-speaking kids, that belief.
Absolutely. Within our own institution, bilingualism at the Health Sciences Center was reason to pay people less.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Myth 5. Myth 5? Myth 4? Yes. Myth 5. Well, even so, Spanish has been strongly rooted in this area for 4 centuries. New Mexican Spanish is in no danger of being lost. Au contraire. The use of Spanish and fluency in the language, both locally and across the United States, is declining before our very eyes. Only a quarter of the New Mexico, Colorado Spanish Survey consultants were willing to rate their ability in Spanish as good. Over half were unable to come up with a Spanish word for dragonfly. Nearly a third could provide no Spanish label for ankle. And this is a kicker, our consultants are a restricted subsample of the Hispanic population. Only Spanish speakers were included in our survey.
On the handout, you have our contents, with the different chapter contents. And so I'm going to show some maps that reflect the content of these various chapters. Now, the first of these maps is a retention. A retention is something that was used, we used at one time, and continues being used here, but is no longer being used in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world, or at least in areas, we should say. There's always somewhere else that they use the particular term. This one is for the word blouse. Now, why do we say retention on that? You can see that there's the border and the traditional variation. The traditional, again, to the north with the round green circles, and the squares being the new or innovative form. How do we know that? Well, blusa is recorded in the diachronic database, online database of the Spanish Academy. It's first recorded in 1828, and it comes from the French form. So blouse in English is a word that has been borrowed from French, just as the Spanish variant is being borrowed. So it's a fairly new form, right? And cuerpo being the older form, meaning more or less like bodice, is then in the far north. Let me show you a map of a Caribbean influence. Languages always borrow. English is a great borrower. This one is the word Nahua. Nahua is from the Taino dialect, or Taino language, which was in the area of Española. Okay? And it went into Spanish as enagua, or enaguas, more often in the plural. And it came into New Mexico, and it shows up in the north. So here's a Caribbean form that remains, and that had to be by the early colonists. And we actually have, from the explorers, we have statements that show that Nahuatl was used. And then you have the newer form, falda, coming up in the south and is part of the border area. Let's look at another borrowing, which had to come in with the earlier colonists. Cajete. Cajete is a Nahuatlismo. It's from the Aztec language. And the word that, or the form was tub or wash tub. And it really meant an earthen bowl in Nahuatl. And then it was then extended in use to mean this tin tub, which a lot of older people ended up being bathed in, or dishes washed in. And then the new term is tina. And so tina is more modern Mexican. This is the form tub. Cajete is used in the traditional area. Now, there's independent development. Because of isolation, words change and meanings change. The meanings can be extended from one form to another form. So in the north, they use the term trucha for fish. They actually truchar. So they'll go out and fish, and it's truchar. So they've got a verb from the noun trucha. Why? Trout was the most common fish in the north. How do we know this? that it's extended. The fish that, the picture of the fish that we showed was a fish that was swimming, and it was obviously not a trout. So that's the way we were able to find this out. Now the, excuse me, the other two forms in standard Spanish is pez, that's a fish that's alive and is swimming, and the picture showed a fish that was swimming, and obviously very much alive. And then pescado is a fish that's already caught. Well, the form used in the border area is pescado, even though this was a live fish. Now, let's look at one of the forms that we found that is a local development. And this local development is for the form crumbs. Crumbs in Tewa, probably. There was one study that indicated that that the northern form, or the traditional form, I should say not traditional in this case, because it's in the center, if you notice. So you have cunques. Now most people will go on, and I'll talk to about coffee grounds, but cunques as crumbs is in the northern part, and it could be from Zuni, it could be Tewa, but it's an influence from the Pueblo languages. And very few have entered into Spanish actually in this area. And so, cunc means corn, ques means grounds or crumbs. Okay, cunques. And here is the example of coffee grounds. And as you know, you can notice that coffee grounds is throughout the entire state, and so it has taken over the area. Actually, in the Atlas Lingüístico de Mexico, there were 6 cases of cunques as coffee grounds appearing in Mexico. Now, another influence, English, of course. So we have the Nahuatl term coming into New Mexico with the early explorers, because why? It didn't exist in the New World, so it was picked up in the Old World. So it was picked up in the New World, and so we know that had to come in with the explorers when they first came, and then the first colonists. So it's an early entrance into New Mexico. We chose this to show you because the Anglicism has to be a pretty recent one. And why? Because it's very localized up in that north area. And the area is fairly small in its extension. It's pinates, and it's obviously from English. Let me show you another early Mexicanism, which was of great interest to us, because huesito sabroso, or hueso sabroso for ankle, we don't know where it came from. We can guess, we can do a little bit of folk etymology here, but that's what it would be. We have no documentation of its origin. But by its extension, we know that it was used pretty extensively and quite early in New Mexico. The form that is the modern term, or the standard term, and is used throughout Mexico is tobillo, and it's also the border term. But let me show you something in Mexico. Now, tobillo is throughout all Mexico, and we haven't shown that here. But the hueso and huesito sabroso is in the area of where? What is that area? Chihuahua. That's right. It sort of extends down there. So it's a northern Mexican term, right? And it obviously was throughout most of Mexico at one time, but has been pushed up into that northern area. is Tobillo has taken over. This, we tend to think of New Mexico as only the two dialect areas. Well, there's subdialect areas. And this is one that shows those subdialect areas. One of the subdialects. And it's the Northeast bundle. And you can look in here and see. For instance, for Turkey, they use ganso. Other forms, guajalote, cocono, cocano, guijalo, but in this area, in Torque, of course. The other one, for goose, ansara, in place of ganso. Mope is in that northeast quadrant. One very characteristic is melas for honey instead of miel.
For syrup.
For syrup. For syrup. Yeah. So you can see that there exists this dialect boundary.
Just a couple of words from the final chapter. The New Mexico-Colorado Spanish Survey Project has caught an important view of the Spanish language as it exists in New Mexico and southern Colorado today. With that information, we have attempted, through this dialect atlas, to bring an understanding to the complexity of variation hidden behind the word Spanish, or Mexicano, in this region. We celebrate all the dialects spoken in this area and would hope to see all of them forge brightly into the future, but this is wishful thinking. The future of New Mexican Spanish seems clear. The social forces that will shape this future are now set firmly in place. Spanish is no longer consistently transmitted to successive generations. The children and grandchildren of today's Spanish speakers grow up with little or no command of the language. If they do manage to develop Spanish skills, it is through interaction with their peers. It is apt to be the colloquial Mexican Spanish because their Spanish-speaking peers tend to be immigrants and the children of immigrants. Thus, we have every reason to expect that the traditional Spanish of northern New Mexico, I lost my place. Thus, we have every reason to expect that the traditional Spanish of New Mexico will undergo the dialect extinction that has already befallen the traditional Spanish of other southwestern states, such as, for example, the old California Spanish in California, which no longer exists, really, essentially. Within another couple of generations, the unique New Mexican Spanish, to the extent that the language is spoken at all, will have been reabsorbed by its mother tongue, Mexican Spanish. In brief, it is entirely likely that the archive formed from the language knowledge shared by the 357 consultants to our project will be one of the few manifestations left of traditional Spanish 50 or 100 years from now. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
What hope is there in moving away from English as a second language to requiring all children to graduate from 8th grade with 2 languages?
That would be wonderful, but it's likely to be Mexican Spanish.
Our goal should be that.
Yeah, but it's likely to be Mexican Spanish, not the traditional Spanish of northern New Mexico. Yeah. Yeah, that's a wonderful idea.
I know children now in 2nd and 3rd grade that are in bilingual education who are not native Spanish speakers.
That's true.
But who speak Spanish.
Right.
It seems to me it should be a major push.
Yes, it is. Yes, sir.
Neddy, soy el otro Vigil. Eddie, Edward. I got 2 questions. Sure. Number one is, I think I'm one of the Cryptojews. You know, with Stan and Tomas Atencio and Rowena Rivera. And Rowena Rivera, speaking Ladino, said when she came to northern New Mexico, she thought, I'm home. What have you found and what are your comments on that?
We actually didn't look at that situation at all. But is in retention, there are some forms that would have gone back to that period where you had the Inquisition and there was movement out of Spain.
Well, one of my test words has always been mucho and mucho.
Well, that was a common difference in the north. They say mucho, but instead of mucho.
And, sir, to your knowledge, is mucho a Ladino, a Sephardic Spanish word? I don't think so. If you know
That's why I'm asking
anything
you.
about Sephardic Spanish, what's called Ladino, there is no linguistic evidence, certainly in the pronunciation and the grammar, that suggests there's
Okay,
any...
well, my source is Rowena Rivera on some
Yeah.
of the early studies here,
Yeah,
84.
but no, there are Cryptojews evidence of that, but it's not manifested linguistically.
Okay.
Linguistically,
Next one for you, because probably you were the same way, Neddy. You grew up in New Mexico, right?
part of it, some of it now,
Okay.
after the third grade here in
Okay.
Albuquerque.
I spent most of my professional career in California, but I always grew up being called Hito. And I do not hear that, and did not hear it in Southern California. It's always Hijo.
Yeah.
And so I was going to say, if you'd seen those kind of variations too, Hito and Hita instead of a, and I've not seen that in.
Yeah, Ito.
Hijito,
Hijito.
But it was always said Hito.
Just Hito.
Yeah, Ito. Not so much.
Well, a thing that's related to that is if you get things, the aspiration of the S at the beginning of a word like hijeñor, that's uniquely northern New Mexican. Well, not uniquely, it also occurs in northern Mexico and other places.
It does in the
Well,
Chihuahua
I
area.
did not see it in California at all. At all.
Yes, sir.
The thing that I found in living in northern New Mexico is we suffer, I think, more of a crisis of identity because of the length of time that people of Hispanic or Spanish descent, that we've been occupying the lands in the north. We're not really connected to Mexico, so this Mexican label is kind of lost its meaning on the peoples here in the north, and especially with the migrations. And if you study the history of New Mexico, more of Arizona claimed southern New Mexico than northern. I mean, northern has always been its very own cat, its very own particular, and I'm not surprised linguistically that it would be special as well. I mean, we really aren't part of anything in the South because I think of our isolation.
Okay, can I respond to that,
Oh,
Neddy?
okay, go ahead.
As an outsider, Neddy is northern New Mexican also, so he has some of these same prejudices, and I didn't have time to go. I didn't have time to go into it, but there's documentation in the text. This is really a sociological thing that has to do with the history of New Mexico since the U.S. took over, and the history of discrimination against Hispanics in New Mexico who tended to be in northern New Mexico. And these were people that were politically powerful, people who had land and property, and then these Mexican immigrants come in from the south and they're poor, they don't have property, and so there was as much discrimination against the incoming Mexicans by other Hispanics. But now, the clincher for the idea that this is strictly sociological, in Spanish, every Spanish speaker in northern New Mexico says, somos mexicanos, okay? We're Mexican. But they don't say we're Mexican in English, but they say somos mexicanos. In fact, they say, hablamos mexicano, right? Yes. Oh, listen to our tapes. Most people in northern New Mexico will say, sí, todos hablan mexicano. This is very, very common and shows that there really was not that historical separation until the U.S. took over. And it's this reverse kind of a discrimination that is as bad as the discrimination by the Anglos.
Yeah, and without the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Querétaro Accord that guaranteed Nuevo Mexicanos their land right, okay, they would have had nada. And I think in my 30 years in studying culture, it, as you point out, it's the shame-based identity. Que ser mexicano en inglés es muy doloroso. It's much easier to be Spanish. After all, it was an empire. They were conquistadores. They wore metal, as opposed to the recent immigrants who were desterrados. You know, so it's very complex. But ultimately, we can call ourselves whatever we want, whether it's Cryptojews or Spanish or Mexicanos.
Thank you. Yes.
Let's see. Let's see. I'll introduce myself really quick. I'm 39 years old. I am from Rio Arriba, and I am fluent in my dialect. And I say that because I had some curiosity. I saw some curiosities in the book that I wanted to address about this. You have in here some documentation about the word jejen,
Yes.
mosquito in English. And that the word mosquito is influenced by the English word of the same, derived from somewhere else in Latin America. And that because it is virtually the same word, it has found use. And the thing is, I had learned growing up, mosquito was a gnat. In other words, it's the diminutive of mosca. And jejen was a mosquito, that is the long-legged with the little... The other one was the confusion, I thought, and I'm asking you because you might be authorities on this, ankle, sancarrón. The way I had understood it, sancarrón is the large bone, and then there was two bones above it, the tibula and the fibula.
Yes.
And those are called hueso chachaquero and hueso sabroso.
Oh, hueso sabroso for up here?
For down here.
Oh,
yeah.
hueso sabroso.
These two bulges on the side. One has a distinct name from the other. I thought that was curious. Now, there is difficulty because the language, is dying. There was some people who couldn't tell me, well, which is the chachaquero. I had been up to now using it as the one that is the rotation axle point, and the other one that rotates. The chachaquero would be the one that moves the most in this case. Those particulars were not covered in the book, and I thought, well, how did you approach the informants on these two issues?
Well, we didn't get the chachaquero, I don't recall at all.
Yeah, I didn't see it in the book.
Let's see, we got 28 sancarrón. So it did appear.
For ankle.
For ankle. But we don't know whether that is the form that they used normally or if that was by mistake. They had lost the ability to make the distinction.
See, I thought because they're so close together, that's probably why they lost distinction.
Could be. Now, the jejen, actually it was a small, in the Caribbean, it's a very, very small mosquito, more like a gnat that has a terrible bite to it, a sting. And so it's almost like a no-see-em in the Texas dialect. And then sancarrón in Mexico is the one with the long legs. Zancudo, right? So that was the big one. Forms like Mosco was a form used a long time ago in Spain, in Andalusia. So there's quite a few different forms. Yes.
One more comment though, this came up as a subject amongst our number. They call this thing about New Mexicans' belief that they're distinct as New Mexican Exceptionalism is what I heard it called. And I was persuaded by some, especially in some of the departments here at UNM, that this is a psychological feeling of inferiority, so we had to measure our acceptance into America by our degree of whiteness, by calling ourselves Spanish. But I was finding different issues about that, because in history, like let's say for example 1837, there was some rebellions going on in Mexico, and it had to do with regionalisms, and it had to do with animosity against a centralized, far-off power trying to assume control. And it was a tax rebellion. And I saw manifestations of a feeling of distinction. I saw manifestations of a writer named Rafael Chacon, who died in 1919, who wrote that although we had common language and some aspects of culture, he felt we were distinct as well by our isolation in the face of our settlement, our oneness with the land here, and our being surrounded by enemies that we had to contend with ourselves without aid from the outside.
Those are things that we didn't really deal with in the book, because it's a language book.
But of course,
Right,
the
of
phenomenon
course.
is a universal human. Of any large group of people, you're going to get smaller groups, and unfortunately, frequently leads to hatred and disdain and other sorts of things. But it's the human
Old
failings.
patria chica.
See, my thought on it is that by regionalistic isolation is what creates dialects.
Isolation does bring dialect change, but dialect change is a natural phenomenon.